Well, I made it through November. Time for a wrap up. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I have a wrap up for the month of November, what I read, what I'm reading now, and a little bit of what I'm planning on reading throughout the next month and what's going on. I'll say November was not the best reading month for me, in large part because I had some exams in the middle of the month. For those of you who don't know, at the monastery where I live, I am part of a 25-year-long study program that does an in depth exploration of Buddhist philosophy. And we have 5 exams throughout the year, and the two kind of biggest, most stressful exams both just happened this last month. The first one was in the middle of the month, and then the second one was about 10 days after that. So most of my time for the first 2/3 of the month was studying and cramming and preparing for those exams, and I only read a little bit around the outside edges. And then on top of that, the first few books I read this month, a number of advanced reader copies I read, weren't especially great, and so that kind of put me in a little bit of a slump. Luckily, it's picked back up. I rallied, and the books I've been reading now, I'm really excited for. So I'm back, where I want to be. But it's been a slow month, a difficult month. So I'll talk quickly about what I did read, what I'm reading now, what my December looks like, and then also, I had a little bit of I don't know if a moral dilemma is the right way to phrase it, but an issue come up around reviews recently. So I might talk about that at the end as well. Okay, so what did I read in November? Well, the first thing to talk about, I mentioned very briefly in my last video, which is GARBOLOGY, the Anthology of Awesome Trash, and I actually finished that. I hadn't finished it when I recorded my last wrap-up video, but I did finish it, I think, on the last day of October, and I loved it. I talked more about it in my previous wrap-up, so you can go hear about it there. In short, I thought it was great, and even if I wasn't a part of it, and even if I didn't have a story in it, I would still love it. I think it's really wonderful that it exists, and I had a ball reading it. Okay, how about I first talk about the arcs that I read that I'm not going to do feature reviews on because they did not wow me. And none of them were bad, but I feel like if I did a review, I'd have more criticism than compliment. And so therefore, it's maybe not that useful to do a full length review. But since they weren't that bad, I will mention them. The first one is a book called The Way by Carrie Groner. And this is set in the near future in a kind of apocalyptic wasteland. It's set in the US, and there's been some, effects of climate change kind of changing the landscape. But then on top of that, there was a plague that came and killed out the vast majority of the population. And that happened maybe 15 years or so before the events of our story. And like many post apocalyptic scenarios, our main character is in one place and he receives what may be the cure to all that ails humanity, and he has to bring that cure to another place while being followed by people that want to stop him for unknown reasons. So that is like every other post-apocalyptic story. The plot is pretty generic, but with that plot, you can do a lot of interesting things, right? Um, and unfortunately, this book tries to do them, but isn't wholly successful. So, what did I like about the book? I thought that the main character and his internal conflicts and his internal kind of dilemmas and so forth were really interestingly laid out. I thought he was a really well rounded character that I enjoyed spending time with. He is like a middle aged guy, and the interesting thing is that due to this plague, people his age are considered ancient because they just don't exist because the sickness that comes affects older people. And so I thought he was a great character. As he traveled, the way the landscapes were described, I thought was really well done. I appreciated the different kind of places he went to get from Colorado to California. I thought the pacing was mostly good. The balance of like action set pieces and traveling lull contemplative moments. So for the most part, I enjoyed that. Now, the reason I'd say I have more criticism than compliments is firstly the all the other ancillary characters were as interesting as they needed to be to fit the story and no more than that. And I think most of what happened kind of fell into that mold. So the way he navigated every one of the obstacles that came in his way was super convenient. It didn't feel realistic for the world that was built, right? And so none of it drew me in as being plausible. Another part of it is that the character and the author, practices a type of American Buddhism. And a big part of this character's journey is he's engaging in this kind of philosophical exploration of how does he live his morals and live his ideals in this apocalyptic wasteland, and is it possible to be the kind of person he wants to be when faced with these kind of obstacles. And I think that's great. Obviously, as a Buddhist monk, I'm interested in exploring Buddhist philosophy in fiction. That's like my whole thing. However, it was so heavy handed in this book. There was nothing subtle about it at all. It was very didactic feeling. And on top of that, the kind of philosophical dilemmas that he's wrangling with are the kind of things you would wrangle with after you do your first, 10-day retreat. They aren't the kind of things that someone who'd been practicing for many years, as he has been, would be wrangling with, I don't think. And not in my experience of students who I've met. So it just felt like very surface level philosophical exploration done in a very heavy handed way. And if it was very deep, like really, really complicated philosophical explanation, then being heavy handed might have been okay. Or if it was the surface level exploration, but it was more subtle and it was woven into the story in a way that was kind of seamless and didn't feel so didactic, that also would have been okay. But to have it be these not incredibly deep philosophical exploration on top of really heavy handed, very preachy almost style, it just didn't really work for me. Everything felt convenient. Nothing felt surprising. Nothing felt especially innovative. And so that's why it didn't quite gel for me. I liked the character. I thought the pacing was good. I thought the environment was good. There was a little bit of magical realism mixed in. He is traveling with a bird and a cat that he can talk to. And at the beginning, he's questioning if maybe he's going crazy or can he really talk to them? It's not clear. It becomes a little bit less ambiguous and maybe even less interesting as the story progresses. But so that's mixed in, which is nice because it gives him someone to talk to. So he's not just monologuing the whole time. So there were good parts of the story. And if you like post-apocalyptic fiction and you like these kind of, travel stories, getting from A to B, these MacGuffin kind of stories, then there is some interesting things here. Just didn't quite do it for me. The next one that didn't quite do it for me is another book in the Splatter Western series. I'm trying to read all the books in the Splatter Western series by Death Head Press, and I happened to get an advanced reader copy of this one. And this one is called Sing Me a Death Song by Robert Essick. So it's a horror western with some splattery, gory elements and a few supernatural elements mixed in. And I liked the overall plotting of this. I liked the structure of it. I liked the idea of it. It just didn't come together. So this is a novella, and it probably could have been about 20 pages longer. And I think if it was, that might have fixed some of the problems. So what's it about? What I really appreciated about it, actually, is that it has two storylines happening simultaneously in the beginning, and then about halfway through the book, they meet and they converge into one storyline. And you don't see that a lot in this genre. So I thought that was an innovative way to approach this genre. The main storyline follows a character named Blue, who is a bounty hunter, and he has left his homestead after his mother died. The homestead is being cared for by some farmhands, and he finds out that one of the enemies he has created through his life of being like a savage bounty hunter has taken over his mother's homestead and is now basically waiting for him to come back because they're going to take it over and burn it to the ground unless he comes back and they can enact their revenge against him. That's, I guess the anticipation. So he has to go home to kind of avenge his family and get his homestead back. At the same time, in his hometown, there happen to be these three traveling musicians traveling through. And these traveling musicians can sing magic into being. And when people heckle them at their show, at their concert, they sing them death songs. So they'll sing a song that describes the gruesome way this person is going to die. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, that person dies in the most gruesome of ways without anyone else in the room. It's some sort of magical force that they have. And so they are kind of feeding off of the town. And the town doesn't want them there anymore. But anytime the town tries to do anything, they just kill someone else with a death song. These two storylines are going to meet, and he is going to come into the path of these traveling musicians and either confront them or turn them onto his side or something to that extent. So that whole setup is interesting. And on top of that, there are some good action scenes, a few like good bloody, gruesome scenes. One of the people who have taken over his mother's homestead, appreciates a little bit of torture now and then. So there's some really kind of gross, bloody scenes, if that is what you're interested in when reading, horror westerns. So you have that aspect, which are fun to read. The action scenes that do exist, I think, are well written. They're fun. The pacing is fine. The pacing of the book overall, I think, is really good. The characters are so like they're shadows. You know what I mean? They don't have as much depth as you'd hope for them to have. And the relationships between characters they don't gel. So many people react to others in ways that just don't seem believable given the world that they have created. And that is where it falls apart for me, is that I think maybe just an extra 20 pages of deepening those relationships to make them feel more lived in, more realistic, whether it be between Blue and his girlfriend, who he has this woman who he thinks of as a girlfriend, but he barely spends any time with her because she stays in the hometown where he's from and he's out doing bounty hunter work. But his interactions with her just feel really forced and they don't feel like there's any depth to them. And then the actions between the other townspeople and how they engage with this trio of magical singers, just none of it feels like it coheres in a way, you know? It feels like the plot points were set out, and then how to get from A to B to C to D wasn't as much of a concern as hitting all those plot points, if that makes sense. And the plotting, like I said, that works, but all of the material getting from A to B, from B to C, and so forth, just feels like it needs to be a little bit more robust. So I had a fun time reading it, but it wasn't great. And then the last arc that I read that I'm not doing a committed review on, I read also in concert with Nonfiction November, and this is called A Livable Future is Possible by Noam Chomsky. And it is actually a series of interviews between Noam Chomsky and C.J. Polychronu. And I really appreciate Noam Chomsky and the way he thinks and the way he understands the world and explains the world. So I was looking forward to reading these. And they did not win me over for a few reasons. One, I think the structure of the book is just odd. The structure of the book, so it's a series of interviews, but it's in a chronological order or reverse chronological order. So the first interview comes from June of 2023. And then the last interview in the book is from July of 2022. So it goes in this reverse chronological order over the course of 1 year. And that's just a weird way to structure the book, because sometimes he'll talk about the same issue more than once in different essays or different interviews. But it's not like you see the progression of his thought or the expansion of his thought. In some ways, you're seeing the regression of his thought, because he doesn't talk about things the same way in every interview. But since you're going backwards in time, you don't really see his thought developing, which is just a very odd way to structure the book. And then on top of that, since these are all interviews dealing with contemporary events, unlike some of Chomsky's books, which are dealing with bigger systems, bigger structures, these are very specific, right? So you don't have as much that you can extrapolate out from these interviews to think about the world or society as a whole. They're very specific interviews. And in that way, it's a good archive, and Noam Chomsky is 95 years old. I don't anticipate he's going to be writing another book anytime soon. So being able to archive his thought is a good prospect. And in fact, this is the 4th collection of his essays or his interviews that's published by Haymarket Books, who's publishing it. So obviously there is an audience for it or a wish to archive it in a meaningful way. So I can appreciate that. But just reading it wasn't particularly illuminating. What I did enjoy is that Chomsky's thought is so expansive, and he has such a command of history, both American history and world history, that he takes that whole command of history and bears it on whatever issue he is discussing. And so he looks for historical precedent, both historical reasoning and consequences of similar situations. So nothing is looked at just in isolation. It's looked at in a much bigger lens, which I am very appreciative of. And in all of these essays, he does something similar to that. So on any given essay, I appreciated reading what he had to say about it. But just as a collection, it did not do a whole lot for me. And especially, this is a nitpick, but it's called A Livable Future is Possible. And in the introduction, C.J. Polychronu talks about how Chomsky is always an optimist, and we can't be defeatist about the state of the world, and that Chomsky responds to the world's problems and the world's issues in a way that only an optimist can do. And he's always hopeful. But I didn't get any hope reading this collection at all. It was actually very pessimistic, because yes, he says there is a way out of all these problems, but it's never something we can do. Like in almost every one of the issues, the way that the problem is fixed is the billionaire class, who is the heart of the problem, changing their minds. The people that have the most political power and have the most to lose in terms of wealth and power, they just giving that all up and deciding to do the right thing. Like that's how it can be fixed. So the optimism is so far as we haven't gone so far down the path that it's impossible to turn back. But the truth is, he doesn't give any strategic ways that we can achieve that reversal. He just says that it's possible. But in all cases, it's possible if the people with the most power and the most money and the ones that are doing the exploiting change their minds and just decide not to be dictators anymore or not to be exploitative billionaires anymore, So that's not like an optimistic outlook. And so the idea that this is charting a course for how a livable future is possible, I don't know, it didn't feel like it was doing that to me. So that is another book. I appreciated it quite a lot, but it didn't do it for me. So those 3 books are all advanced reader copies I read. They're all being published sometime in December. And if they sound interesting to you, you can pick them up. None of them were bad. And I found moments of joy and insight reading all of them, as I try to do with any book I read. So none of them would have been DNF material, put it that way, but they just weren't kind of what I was hoping for them to be in some ways. Now those are out of the way. What else did I read? I did read a book, another arc called What the Woods Took by Courtney Gould. And this I liked a lot. This is following a troubled young woman, a teenager who is kidnapped in the middle of the night and is sent to a wilderness therapy camp to, fix her bad behavior, quote unquote. And she's there with 5 other troubled teens. And then after about a week or so camping, they wake up and their counselors are missing and they don't know what happened to them. They don't know if this is part of the program or not. And then they notice that there seems to be something in the woods that is hunting them. And they have to figure out what to do next, how to survive. So I enjoyed that a lot. I have a review of that coming up soon. I did also read 2 short story collections. One of them is a short story collection by Brian Keene, and that is called The Rising, More Selected Scenes from the End of the World. And this I thought was great. Brian Keene wrote a novel called The Rising, it was published in 2003, and it's about a zombie apocalypse. And since then, he has written 1 sequel and 1 sidequel to it, I believe, and then a collection of short stories based in that world. And this is another collection of short stories based in the world of the zombie apocalypse. So you just get thrown right in, and every short story is a small slice of life of someone living through the zombie apocalypse. I thought they were great. I thought they were a lot of fun. Highly recommend it. And then I also read the collection, The Horror That Represents You. And this is an anthology edited by S.D. Vasallo. And this one I had a lot of fun with. I did not have high expectations going in because it seems like a very odd theme for an anthology collection. Just what scares you the most. I'm like, well, that's every horror collection, isn't it? But I was very wrong. These stories have a lot of heart. Most of them fall into a type of psychological horror, but there is a good mix of different subgenres, and I had a lot of fun with this. So those 2 collections, I have a review of both of those coming up maybe next week, I think, coming up soon. And then because of that, I was looking at what other books Brian Keene had written, and I was able to get With Teeth, which is a novella he wrote about vampires in Appalachia. From my library. It was ready to borrow right away, and I thought it was great. So that is another book I read, With Teeth by Brian Keene, a small Appalachian vampire story where the vampires are not shiny and pretty, but they are these feral, wild things. So that was a great story. I highly recommend that, actually. And it's a quick read, like an hour, so very short novella. Now, on top of that, I did read 2 Stephen King books this month, actually reread, in anticipation of this project that I'm working on, the Buddhist Path in Fiction Stephen King edition. So the first book I reread was The Long Walk. That's going to be the book we focus on for my first, I guess technically my second video in that series. The first video I did last month, that was the introduction. And then next Monday, the 8th of December, will be the first video that I'm actually focusing on a book, and that will be focused on The Long Walk. And it was a joy to reread this book. I'm so glad I did. Even with that series notwithstanding, it's a great book. I haven't read it in probably over a decade, and I'm really glad I did. It's a really, really good book. So I'll talk more about that next week. The other Stephen King book I reread is the one I anticipate doing for January's edition of the Buddhist Path in Fiction, and that is Lisey's Story. And I also haven't read that in maybe 4 or 5 years, and I loved it the first time I read it, and I loved it this time as well. It's a little bit controversial. I know not everyone loves that book, but I think it's great, and I'm excited to talk more about that in the future. So I did read those 2 books, or reread those 2 books. For Nonfiction November, I managed to read one other book, and that is The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And this I loved. I thought it was great. I'd heard him talk a lot in the promotion of it before it was released, including I've heard him respond to a lot of the criticism that people have leveled against it. And just the way he speaks about it and the way he responds to that criticism itself was so meaningful to me. And the book I really, really enjoyed. It's a collection of 3 essays. The first one is an essay that is about his trip to Senegal. The second one is about his trip to South Carolina, I think, where one of his books was in the process of potentially being banned. And then the third one is about his trip to Palestine, and that is the longest section of the book. And I think all 3 sections of the book are incredible. I think his insight and analysis and his humanity are really on display. But what I will say, what I appreciated possibly the most of this whole collection is that the collection is structured as a series of essays that he is writing to one of his writing classes at Howard University. So that is hypothetically the audience for these essays that he's writing. And because of that, woven within every one of the essays is him exploring the importance of writing and the importance of language and the importance of being an artist or a writer or a creator, and how art or language or writing can serve as a locus for change in the world. And that, I think, is really powerful. Even aside from the individual essays, and they were all very moving and very affecting, aside from that, what I think I almost appreciated the most was this idea of how important writing is that he wove in and out of every single one of the essays. It's like an underlining theme that goes through all of them. I thought it was really, really well done. And I just thought the combination of activism and social awareness and art and the way he combined them in this book is really, really wonderful. So I highly recommend that. And then the last 2 titles that I completed this month were two collections of poetry. They're both horror poetry or horror adjacent poetry. One's called Bestial Mouths by Brenda S. Tolian, and one is called On the Subject of Blackberries by Stephanie M. Widovich. And these were both fun. It's hard to really talk about poetry for me if it's not poetry that is really incredibly captivating and like grabs me and grips me tight. It's hard for me to talk about it in a way just because it is so subjective. However, I did try to make a review of those two collections because I enjoyed both of them, and that review will be coming out sometime later in the month. I don't know if it's this week or next week, but that'll be coming up soon. So those are the titles I completed in this month. So 13 titles completed, which is a lot for having a slow reading month. But of those 13, 2 of them were short story collections, 2 of them were poetry collections, and then 2 others were novellas, and 2 were rereads. So, it wasn't a lot of new material. Now, I am reading 3 books right now at the same time, and that is part of what has really energized the end of the month for me. Is I have 2 buddy reads going on, and these are the first 2 buddy reads I've ever done in my life, and so it's just interesting that I'm doing both of them at the same time. The first one is I'm reading The City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this is the first book in his Tyrant Philosophers trilogy, and I'm reading that with Alex from Alex Unabridged, and we are both having a blast with this book. And it is Tchaikovsky doing fantasy, an urban kind of fantasy, set in like an oppressive authoritarian state, and I won't say more about it now because I am going to talk more about it in the future because I'm looking forward to reading the second book, which I already have, and I just received an advanced reader copy for the third book because the third book is being released in March of 2025, and I just received a copy of it. So I'm going to be doing a review, if not of these individual books, then of the series as a whole, but that has really lifted my spirits at the end of the year, at the end of this month, to be reading that with Alex. And then the other buddy read I'm doing is of Stoner by John Williams, and I'm reading that with Carl from Please Read Your Book. He suggested that we read this book together, and we actually have a video coming out soon on his channel, which I will link to in the pinned comment once it is released. That I think we're going to make a number of videos. The first one is just about why we chose to read this book and do a buddy read together on this book and what we're hoping to get out of the buddy read. And then maybe one video about halfway through the book and one again when we finish it, like a wrap-up video. And so I will link to that video once it's uploaded, and that link will be in the pinned comments depending on when you see this video. In any case, I'll have his channel linked in my description, so you can check out his channel. But starting to read that book as well has been really exciting to me, especially I know it's a booktube darling, so getting a chance to kind of be part of the zeitgeist is an interesting thing. And then the last book I'm reading right now is another arc. It's called Mechanize My Hands to War by Aaron K. Wagner. It is a sci-fi book set in the near future where there are androids and there is like a terrorist cult, homegrown terrorist cult who are anti-android, and they're causing all this mayhem. And I've only read the first chapter, so I can't say much about it, but so far I'm enjoying it. So those are the 3 books that I am currently reading right now. I usually don't read 3 books in parallel, but since 2 of them are buddy reads, it is working out because I'm not reading them at my normal pace. I am, trying to slow down the chapters so I can stay in line with what my partner is doing. So what does the month of December look like for me? Well, I will say the month of December looks busy. I have a number of arcs that I haven't finished yet that are coming out in December that I have to read. And I think I have to read all of my arcs that are planned for January. I have to read in December. And the reason is I'm going away for all of January. The entire month of January, my monastery is leaving and going to a separate monastery because we have to study and debate against the monks of that monastery for the whole month. So I won't be near a computer the whole time. I'll have my Kobo with me, and I might be able to bring a book or two, a physical book or two, but I won't be able to make these videos or reviews that are all due in January. So I have 9 books, I think, on the docket that I have queued up to hopefully write reviews for throughout the month of January. But that means I need to get them done in December. So my December reading is going to be mostly dominated by those. And other than my arcs, I'm keeping it wide open. If I do get through all my arcs, we'll see where I am. I am doing my own version of the Read What You Own challenge. So those of you who don't know, Ollie from CriminOlly, I think this is his 3rd or 4th year doing the Read What You Own challenge, which started as a challenge that he made for himself to read books that he owned before purchasing new books. So his challenge was always to read 100 books that he owned before making any new purchases. And then since then, other people have taken the challenge on themselves and kind of modified it to meet their needs. So the way I'm doing the challenge this year is I'm not so concerned with books that I own or how many books I own. I'm more concerned with physical books that I own, because since I live most of my time here in India, but then once in a while back in America, and having physical books is just difficult for me. And so I have collected a number of physical books here that I haven't read yet. I think maybe 75. And I want to read those down so I have 30 or less unread physical books. And until I finish that, I'm not going to read any of my other digital books, not counting ARCs, because I already have digital ARCs that I have promised to read. So, not counting advanced reader copies, I'm going to focus only on reading physical books until I get my number down to about 30 unread books. And all the books I have are books I want to read. It's not like I just buy books randomly. So, that is a good thing. I have no problem just focusing on that as my TBR. However, since I am going away for the whole month of January, I won't be able to bring a lot of books with me. So, I may have to put off my Read What You Own challenge by a month simply because I won't have access to my books. So we'll see how it goes. But once I do finish reading the arcs I have planned for December, which is to say all of the arcs that are being published in December and January, if I finish all those, then I have plenty of books to go through and I will see what I pick up next. I'm not quite sure. So that is where I'm at with my reading, what I read, what I'm reading, what my plans are, even though they're very nebulous. And now I wanted to end with a little bit of this moral dilemma I had come up recently, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on it. I'm going to try to speak in abstract terms though, because I don't want to put anyone out on blast. I've been receiving advanced reader copies and writing reviews on Goodreads for a few years before I started on YouTube. And I wrote a review for a book over a year ago that was not very good. I think I gave it 2 stars, and I gave it 2 stars because it had some good ideas and it had some good, it was ambitious, but the writing was just really not very good. Every page was riddled with like lots and lots of spelling errors. And that happens sometimes when you're reading advanced reader copies because they're pre-print, but the amount of errors in this was distracting. It wasn't like 1 error or 2. It was a lot, and enough that it was very, very distracting. I'm not going to harp on the book. I just didn't think it was very good. Whatever, it is what it was. I wrote a not great review where I did explain the things that I appreciated in the novel and the things I thought that were done well and that were interesting. But then I said these are the reasons I don't like it, which is what I try to do whenever I write a negative review. And after I wrote that review, the author commented on my review on Goodreads saying, "Thank you for writing a review. I'm sorry you didn't like the book, but I appreciate that you read the whole thing." It was very polite, very courteous, saying thank you. And then 2 days ago, so more than a year after that was posted, I went to Goodreads and I had a message in my Goodreads inbox from the author. And it was long. It was maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs long, and about how my review was awful and it was horrible and it was mean and it caused the author's soul to hurt every time they looked at it. And would I please take it down because it was horribly biased and wrong. And then they went through point by point why they thought my review was wrong. And all of their arguments didn't really make a lot of sense and weren't really based in either my review or the book, but so be it. So I saw this and I didn't respond to it. And my first instinct was, well, I'm not going to respond to this. And I'm not going to take down my review because my review is fair and it's not overly mean. And I'm not going to cave in to someone else like bullying me to take down a review. But then I was thinking about it, and clearly for them to write this to me, they were going through something. And I don't write professionally. I'm not, I'm not writing for like a magazine or a website or anything. And it doesn't really harm me to take this review down. And whatever they're going through, me responding to their message isn't going to help them get through it. And truthfully, me leaving the review up or taking it down isn't going to fix the bigger problem that is going on in their life that motivated them to write this letter to me. But I don't need to be part of whatever problem they're in the middle of. So I took the review down. And I don't feel great about taking the review down. But I also don't care about the review. It was a book that I read that I didn't particularly enjoy. I don't know. It doesn't matter if it's up or not, right? I'm not wedded to that review. It doesn't say anything about me. Yeah, I still don't feel great about taking it down. It still feels like I gave in, right? And that is a weird feeling. So I'm struggling with that. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I'm not going to talk about what the book is or who the author is. Clearly, for him to write a positive note and then over a year later write that negative of a note, something's going on, right? And it's not about me, but I'm in the middle of it. So I don't want to put him on blast. I write reviews because I want people to be able to find the joy I find in books. If someone picks up a book, I try to write reviews in such a way to share what I really enjoyed about the book and what parts of the book didn't work for me. And that way you can know going into the book that maybe the things that don't work for me are the exact opposite for you. It may be that there are things that I really care about that you don't care about at all. So if I make that clear in my review, then you can read the review and say, you know what? Those things that bother him don't bother me. This sounds like a good book, right? So I'm trying to write reviews in such a way to not ever build walls, but to just give my experience of the book and give reasons for my experience. And that way anyone can come to that review and they can read it and use that as a way to guide how they engage with any given book. Right? I'm not trying to stop people from reading. I do try to lift up books and encourage certain books to be read, the ones that I really, really enjoy, that I want more people to read, or that I think not enough people are reading. But aside from those, I try to be neutral insofar as I want to give my experience of a book and let that experience do all the talking. But so I don't particularly like writing bad reviews in general, but I don't want to be manipulative or deceptive in my reviews. So that's why taking this review down, I don't know, it feels like I'm ceding some sort of moral high ground, but I don't really understand what that moral high ground is. It's just like my gut instinct is to not cede that ground. But my logical brain says that there's no reason this is a hill I should die on. Clearly, this means more to him than to me, and no one is going to be hurt by me taking this review down. So I took it down. I don't feel great about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about reviews in general, and what would you do if an author directly wrote to you saying, please take your review down because it hurts my soul? How do you respond to that, especially when you don't want to cause harm to anyone? I didn't write the review to upset him. I was just being honest in my experience. So what would you do in that circumstance? And do you think I was right to take the review down or not? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that down in the comments below, as well as all of the books I did manage to read in November. Have you read any of them? I especially would like to hear your thoughts about horror poetry, because reading those two collections was an interesting experience for me. I think I talk about it a little bit in my review that will be coming up, like I said. Usually, when I read horror poetry, it's one or two poems that sneak their way into an anthology. And almost always, they're the weakest parts of the anthology for me. So to find whole collections of horror poetry and actually appreciate them and enjoy them was an interesting experience. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about horror-adjacent poetry, if you have any. But I think that's all I have for today. I've been talking too long. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.